Why has the concept of radical uncertainty dropped out of financial practices, but economic theory as well? Because I understand that the idea was once there and it's been effectively redacted.
That's right. A century ago, there are two very important books, one by an American economist called Frank Knight, who's actually the founder of the Chicago School of Economics, and Keynes in Britain, whom everyone knows about. And Keynes published a book called A Treatise on Probability, and Knight one called Risk, Uncertainty and Profit. And a key theme for them both was the same, which is there's a distinction between risk, which you can characterise probabilistically, and uncertainty, which you can't. And as you say, over the subsequent 100 years, that distinction got elided. It pretty much disappeared after the Second World War, and we quote Milton Friedman as writing Frank Knight. And interestingly, Frank Knight was actually Friedman's predecessor at Chicago. Frank Knight made this distinction between risk and uncertainty. And Friedman said, I shall not refer further to this distinction because I do not believe it is valid. We can attach probabilities to every conceivable event. Now, why did people think that? And it was fundamental to the way in which economics developed at Chicago and elsewhere at that time. Why did people think that? Why did they want to think that? Well, they wanted to think that because it meant you could fit uncertainty into the rational choice framework which was sweeping the economic world. You didn't have to worry about uncertainty. Risk was just a commodity that could be traded like any other. And that was something you could mathematize quite easily. It made life easier. And it became completely dominant. Really all of finance theory, practical finance theory, is based on this kind of concept.
And that was a mistake.
And that was a mistake. You can't attach probabilities to every conceivable event.
Would it be fair to say that it's easy to make mistakes in economics because economics itself is so complex relative to, let's say, the physical sciences?
Well, I don't know if economics is less complicated than physics, but it's different. And we give the example of NASA sending a spaceship messenger to orbit around Mercury. And you can't simply fire a rocket at Mercury because it will either hit Mercury or go straight past, and that's no use. It was a very complicated job to put something in orbit around Mercury. You had to use the gravitation of the Earth and then of Venus and finally of Mercury itself to nudge it into position. And it was 7 years after launch that it finally reached its destination. And it reached its destination 7 years later, exactly at the time and the place that NASA had envisaged. Now, how could you do that? You can do it, firstly, because you know what the equations of planetary motion are. Secondly, they remain unchanged. They're the same equations as Kepler and others discovered several centuries ago. And finally, the solar system isn't affected significantly by our interaction with it. So that you know what the underlying structure is, that structure remains unchanged, and what we think about the motion of Venus doesn't affect Venus in any way. It's an objective fact. Now, none of these things are actually true of the business and financial world. The underlying determinants are not completely known. They change over time, and they're affected by our beliefs about it. So that's why, in this sense, the job economists have, and business people have, and people in finance have, that job is, in a real sense, more complicated than the seemingly amazingly complicated job of firing a rocket to reach Mercury.
I don't think I'm being too semantic to draw a distinction, though, between complicated and complex, because in a sense, firing a rocket at Mercury, insanely complicated, but also knowable, and they could do it again with roughly the same technique or exactly the same technique, whereas you can apply something that worked yesterday to economics and finance and it won't work again tomorrow.
Won't. Yeah, that's right. Because the underlying determinants are changing over time, and they're changed by our experience of them. So these kind of processes are fundamentally different. So it's quite understandable that people should want to apply the kind of methods which are so effective in parts of the physical world to social sciences, but there are limits to the extent to which you can do it.
Do you know who came up with the term radical uncertainty?
No, I don't, actually. It's sort of been around.
It's just evolved, presumably.
For a long time.
Well, the reason I ask is that I would call it extreme uncertainty, but I think that would be, let me try this on you. I think that could be wrong, because extreme would suggest that it's rare.
Yes, that's right. and it's not rare. Now, there are what Nassim Taleb called black swans. They're improbable because you can't visualize what they are. No one had thought there could be a black swan until you observe them. Now, there are uncertainties like that, but these are quite rare. And the coronavirus, for example, at the moment is a good example of something that lies in between. You know that things like that can happen, but that's a different matter from it being able to say what is the probability that the world economy will be affected by that in February 2020.